She was an it girl in the Golden State.
She had a certain spunk, a certain it factor, and everybody wanted to be with her or around her.
The men loved her. I mean, loved her.
Even though she clearly had a lot of admirers, she was really trying to do it by herself and be really independent.
But when blood-curdling screams ring out, she's at risk of losing it all.
Mika!
He frantically started banging on her door, calling her name. We were panicked. We thought maybe there had been a kidnapping as well.
As detectives investigate, they unravel a story of obsession and betrayal.
He had a crush on her. He was infatuated with her.
Maybe he could not deal with the rejection and finally snapped.
She breaks down and admits, yes, it upset me that my husband went out with this woman.
She told him that tonight she was going to die.
Will the killer evade justice?
Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years.
We were not getting any answers, trying to figure out what had happened.
Or was the real culprit hiding in plain sight?
When he said that to me, the hair on my neck stood up.
The text comes back positive for deception.
I felt like at that moment that I could have been looking at a killer.
January 1999. It's the start of a new year in Richmond, California.
Richmond is an inner city that is located approximately 30 minutes from San Francisco and 20 minutes from Oakland.
Richmond was a working class city with individuals that were trying to make a way for themselves and their families.
The majority of the population of Richmond were good families, good people.
But the Richmond community is also struggling with a growing crime problem.
In the 1990s, for a city that was relatively small, it was plagued by crime.
It was still suffering from the crack epidemic.
It was not uncommon to have multiple homicides on any given day.
On the morning of January 9th, one local resident, Andrew Piper, is still asleep after a relatively quiet night, until he's jolted awake by the sound of screaming.
He was sleeping on his couch, and he was awakened by blood-curdling screams from his neighbor's apartment across a shared driveway.
He knows that a young mother named Mika Wadley lives there with her 18-month-old baby.
He's afraid for their safety, so he quickly ran over there to check on them and see what's going on.
He frantically started banging on Mika's door, calling her name.
Mika!
The neighbor attempts to open the door, but it's locked.
He's continuing to hear the screams for about 30 more seconds, and then it goes silent inside.
Mika, can you hear me? Hello?
He knew that Mika was in trouble, so he returns to his own apartment, he retrieves his phone, and makes the call to 911.
I'm really concerned about my neighbor.
26-year-old Mika Wadley was beautiful inside and out.
She was real sweet, kind-hearted, easy to get along with. She was very lovable. She made you smile. She made you feel good about yourself.
She was so outgoing. She had so many friends. It was just her personality. She had a very nice personality. She got along with everybody.
She just loved being around people. She was a very people person.
But in addition to her outgoing personality, Mika also had a fiery side.
She was a little feisty. People just didn't play with her. If they did challenge her, she would be up for the challenge.
Nobody messed with her. She could back her stuff up very good.
I think you should bet more than that.
You want me to bet more?
More than that.
Mika had a certain spunk, a certain it factor, and everybody wanted to be with her or around her.
The men loved her. I mean, loved her. They were just attracted to her. Her personality, her funness.
She was known for putting guys in the friend zone. She knew her value and she knew her worth.
Hey, who's hungry? You! There we
go. Thank God. I'm starving.
But when she met 22-year-old Pete Smith, he seemed like someone who was worth her time.
They were hanging out. She really, really liked him.
He had this big personality just like she did. So as you can imagine, them together, they were the life of the party.
And just a year into the relationship, it took an exciting turn.
She was like, Terry, I'm pregnant. I'm like, what? And she was like, yeah, I'm supposed to have a baby.
She was very happy when she found out she was pregnant.
I just didn't believe it at the time that she was pregnant. So she must have really been in love with this young man.
She was ready to have a child and to have a family.
But just a few months before Mika's due date, tragedy struck.
The tragedy came about by homicide, where her partner Pete was unfortunately murdered.
Pete was another casualty of the gun violence plaguing Richmond.
Later in the summer, after her partner Pete died, Mika delivered her beautiful baby girl.
Caring for a newborn wasn't easy without Pete.
So she went to a little depressed stage, and she used to cry a lot.
Why don't you let me hold the baby for a little bit? Okay.
We all just took care of her because she always gave us joy, happiness. And now we had to turn around and be that support system, for her.
One such person who became a beacon for Mika in times of need was her close friend, Cameron.
Hey, Kiki. Brought you a little something.
Thanks, Cam.
You're welcome.
Cameron was a friend of the family. Like, we knew his relatives. They actually lived down the hill from us.
She really depended on him as a person to share her life with, get advice from, and to have a friendship with.
I don't know if I can do this without Pete.
Hey, you're not alone. We got you.
Cameron was a really good support system for her. He helped her get through that tough time.
And with her loved one's support, Mika was able to push through the heartbreak and embrace the joys of motherhood.
She loved being a mom.
Motherhood was the best thing that had ever happened to her.
But now, the safety of Mika and her daughter has been called into question after screams were heard from their apartment.
A neighbor called 911 after being woken up by the screaming.
I'm really concerned about my neighbor.
When officers arrive at Mika's apartment, they find her door ajar.
When you see an open door, then you know that there's trouble, there's a problem, so you have to be on guard and ready.
Is anyone here?
When they were clearing the living room area, it was obvious that there had been some type of struggle in there.
Things are all over the place, furniture is moved.
And then they find Mika.
Her hands are tied above her head, and there's a blanket covering her face.
Her underwear had also been pulled down, leading police to believe they may have been dealing with a case of sexual assault.
It's a tragic scene, but it's not a hopeless one.
The officer goes to check on her, and to his surprise, he finds out that she's still alive.
Get in your mess in here.
In January of 1999, 26-year-old single mom Mika Wadley was finding joy in motherhood.
She lost her partner, Pete, shortly after she became pregnant.
It had been a tough year for her. Her daughter was truly a light in the darkness for her.
But now Mika has been found unresponsive on the floor of her apartment after a neighbor reported the sound of screams.
Thankfully, there's still a chance to save her.
Get in your mess in here.
Paramedics responded and transported her to a local hospital.
But where is Mika's 18-month-old daughter?
There's no baby to be found.
We were panicked. We thought maybe there had been a kidnapping as well.
Fortunately, police soon learn that Mika's daughter is safe and sound with family.
She was at my grandmother's house. She was with us.
Upon hearing what's happened, Mika's sister Keela drops everything and heads straight to the hospital, where Mika is now in the ICU.
I got to the hospital and I said, "Where is she?" And he said, "Oh, they're working on her." Then I saw a glass door and you could see them working on her.
They were trying to resuscitate her, but it wasn't going well.
And then they came in the room and they said she died. And I said, "What do you mean she dead?" They said they can't tell me nothing. And that was it.
When Keela communicates the tragic news to the rest of Mika's loved ones, they're equally devastated.
I had a lot of questions. Is this real? When you use a child, it's hard, you know.
To hear that your best friend is dead, that was the worst day of my life. Mika was so joyful, so full of life. Who would want to do something like that to her?
Back in Mika's apartment, detectives begin trying to answer that question.
What was initially a horrific and brutal assault has now become a homicide case.
Outside the residence, investigators locate an important clue.
I noticed that there was a large window screen resting against the fence.
Is this where the perpetrator entered? Is this how the person got into the home?
Inside the apartment, it's clear Mika put up a fight with her attacker.
There's clear evidence that there's been a violent struggle here.
The couch cushions, some were laying on the floor. There was blood evidence. There was a pair of platform boots, and one was missing a black shoelace. So we automatically assumed that how the suspect bound her wrist was by removing the shoelace from Mika's shoe.
Detectives believe sexual assault was the sole motive in this crime.
Her wallet was still there. There was jewelry that was still there.
Aside from the living room where the big fight happened, the house was otherwise untouched. There wasn't anything obvious missing.
But that's not the only reason police think they can rule out robbery as a motive.
When first responders found her, she had a blanket covering her face.
In my experience, when there are homicides or sexual assaults and it's a known offender, they will often cover the victim's face, almost like they didn't want to see the person in their last seconds.
That was a sign to investigators that it was likely someone that she knew.
In their search for answers, detectives turned to the neighbor who called 911, Andrew Piper.
He knew Mika. When he learned that she had been killed, it was devastating to him.
So when you went to check on her earlier this morning, was the door locked?
Well, at first it was.
After calling 911, he walked back to Mika's apartment.
And this time, the door was open.
This was startling to the neighbor in that just moments before, this door was locked.
I thought about going to check in on her at that point, but I was afraid.
He had a little bit of remorse because despite the door being open, he chose not to go in.
Was there anyone else in the vicinity while all of this was going on?
Well, there was this one guy.
He noticed that there was a man in the distance exiting the apartment complex. He was too far away to get a good look, but he believed that he was wearing a beanie and a gray sweatshirt.
His pace and his gait didn't lend one to believe like he was running from the scene. I mean, could it just be a random person just walking toward the bus stop?
Regardless, it's the only real lead investigators have at this point.
Although the 911 caller couldn't give a really detailed description, he was able to give the officers enough to put out an APB for someone wearing a gray sweatshirt and a beanie.
Could this man be the key to unlocking the case?
Detectives in Richmond, California are investigating the death of beloved 26-year-old single mother, Mika Wadley.
Mika Wadley was murdered inside her apartment.
And the only lead they have so far is a vague one.
A neighbor saw a man he didn't recognize leaving the apartment complex after the crime took place. But the man wasn't exhibiting any suspicious behavior, so it's not clear if he had anything to do with it.
As officers continue putting feelers out for this mysterious individual, detectives receive word that the results of Mika's autopsy are in.
Her autopsy spoke volumes. Mika died in probably the most personal way that you can die. She was smothered. That takes a while to take place, and that's very painful.
But according to the autopsy, Mika wasn't sexually assaulted.
She was a firecracker, and she fought him tooth and nail until the end.
She must have fought so hard that her killer was not successful in that regard.
Detectives suspect that after the killer heard Andrew Piper knocking on the door, he knew his time was limited.
When she screamed, he had to know that someone was going to come. He had to know that if he didn't prevent Mika from being able to tell anybody who he was, he, unfortunately for Mika, had to make a decision.
So he smothered her to keep her quiet, and when he thought she was dead, he fled the scene.
But who is he? Investigators hope Mika's family can provide some insight.
Can you think of anyone who would want to attack Mika?
No, everybody loved her.
If you seen her as a person, you wouldn't think she had no enemies at all.
I just couldn't see why someone would want to take her life.
What about a boyfriend? Was she seeing anyone?
Probably in any homicide case where you have a woman who's been killed, I mean, the first person that police always look at is a boyfriend.
But she wasn't with anybody.
After her ex died, she kind of gave up on dating.
She'd just been focused on her daughter and wasn't trying to get into a relationship anytime soon.
So you can't think of anyone that she may have been out with on Friday night?
Mika's family reveals she did go out with someone that evening.
But he's just a friend.
What is his name?
Cameron King.
The detectives learned that the night before, Mika and her good friend Cameron had dropped off Mika's daughter with Mika's family so that the two of them can go see a movie.
The family tells me that he is somebody that she had known for about 6 or 7 years after meeting at a local junior college.
He was real goofy like her. They would just go to the movies and hang out, but she wasn't like attracted to him.
However, Mika's family says Cameron was clearly vying for something more.
And he definitely wanted to date her.
The way that Cameron would kind of gush around, when Mika would speak, they were pretty confident in knowing that he had a crush on her.
Oftentimes, when they were hanging out late, Mika would allow Cameron to crash on her couch, and he would leave early in the morning before she would wake up.
However, the family says a few weeks earlier, Cameron had exhibited some strange behavior.
They didn't really feel, initially anyway, that he would ever act on his feelings, except several weeks prior to Mika's homicide. Mika shared with her sisters that one night Cameron was over watching a movie, she went to bed, he was going to sleep on the couch and then let himself out.
But when she woke up in the middle of the night, she saw Cameron sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at her.
Cameron, what are you doing?
Hey, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna go. I'm gonna leave. Okay. I'm sorry.
It really freaked Mika out.
Based on this unsettling information, detectives can't help but wonder if Cameron had something to do with Mika's death.
At this point, the urgency to speak to him has now increased because here we have a young woman that was found naked from the waist down and having a male friend that I was told that also was infatuated with her, that was close to her, and that may have wanted more.
Maybe he can no longer deal with the rejection and finally snapped.
In January of 1999, detectives investigating the homicide of 26-year-old single mother Mika Wadley are growing suspicious of her friend, Cameron King.
Apparently, Cameron wanted more than just a friendship from Mika, but Mika wasn't into him like that.
Cameron, what are you doing?
Maybe he can no longer deal with the rejection and finally snapped.
Investigators waste no time locating Cameron and bring him in for an interview.
We need to speak with you about your friend Mika.
What about her?
Cameron was informed that Mika was brutally murdered.
Wow, that's just too bad.
You would have expected sobbing, crying, or some shock, and that did not take place with Cameron.
You were close, right?
Yeah, we were close.
I remember sitting in the interview and being very much taken aback by this. Like, we could have been talking about, a sporting event, and it would have been the same.
Did you ever have any romantic feelings for Mika?
Nah.
He flatly denied it. He said that they were just friends and that was not an interest on his part.
Did you watch her in her sleep?
Nah.
He said, no, never happened. I never made any advances on her.
He made it appear as if she were the one that really wanted to be with him.
There was a part of me that felt that he was trying to distance himself from her romantically, given how she died. And I honestly wasn't buying it.
We believe you were the last person to see Mika before she was killed. That does not look good for you.
They asked him to walk them through what he and Mika did on Friday the 8th.
Damn, we just went to see a movie, okay?
And nothing else happened?
That's when Cameron admits that there was something odd that Mika said to him that night.
She knew she was gonna die.
According to Cameron, Mika actually brought up her impending death that night.
And I'll be honest with you, when he said that to me, like, the hair on my neck stood up.
Cam, if I died tonight, would you come to my funeral?
Come on, quit playing.
Promise me you'll come.
All right. Okay, Kiki. I promise I'll be there, okay? But you gotta stop acting so morbid, all right?
Well, did you ever ask her why she felt that way?
Not really. I just changed the subject, it kind of creeped me out.
Which is unusual. If they're such good friends, I would expect him to question, well, what's wrong? Is somebody following you? Like, why would you say that? And he didn't.
After the movie got out around 12:30 a.m., Cameron states that he dropped Mika off at her apartment.
You sure you didn't spend the night?
Not this time.
He leaves and he returns home to his apartment in Oakland, which is about 20 minutes away.
When you dropped her off, did you happen to notice one of the windows had the screen removed?
I asked him, are your fingerprints gonna be on the window? Remember, there was an open window, and his response was, no, I didn't crawl through no window. Again, another red flag, and I challenged him on it. I said, I didn't mention anybody crawling through an open window.
At this point, investigators are extremely suspicious.
But Cameron insists that he was home all night after dropping Mika off.
I dropped her off, I went straight home, got there at 1:30, didn't go anywhere. Went straight to bed. Didn't leave until 10:30 the next morning when I went to work.
Can anyone else corroborate that?
That's when Cameron drops a bombshell.
Cameron says, yes, you can ask my wife.
Cameron is not a single man. He's been in a relationship with a woman named Whitney Clark for 4 years.
She is basically his common law wife that they have a child together.
It suddenly seems extremely strange that he's going out on what seems like a date with another woman to the movies.
This really got the detective's attention because she might be a person that had a motive. Her husband was spending the night at Mika's home, taking her to movies, spending a large amount of time with her.
Investigators contact Whitney Clark, and she agrees to come into the station for an interview.
They started off by asking her if it troubled her that Cameron left her alone so that he could take another woman out to a movie.
Not really. They were just friends. I met her a time or two.
They asked her, did Cameron come home on the night of the 8th? After he took Mika to the movies, and she said yes.
She corroborates Cameron's story. She says that Cameron comes home at 1:30 a.m., gets into bed with her, they watch some TV.
Then they went to bed, and he left for work around 10:30 the next morning.
We know that her neighbor phoned the police around 7:30 a.m. after hearing her screams.
There's no way he could have had anything to do with what happened with Mika.
In her mind, he couldn't have been responsible because he was in bed with her.
You're sure?
100%.
They asked her, would you be willing to take a polygraph test? And she says yes.
The investigators hooked her up to the lie detector machine, and the examiner begins a series of questions.
But it doesn't take long for the needle to spike.
The text comes back positive for deception, that she's not telling the truth.
Richmond detectives are in the midst of interviewing Whitney Clark about the murder of 26-year-old single mother Mika Wadley.
Her common-law husband, Cameron King, was the last person to see Mika alive before she was killed.
Whitney has denied having anything to do with Mika's murder and says she was at home with her young daughter that morning. According to Whitney, Cameron was home too. But is she telling the truth?
So, as a part of her questioning, Cameron's wife was asked to take a polygraph test that she unfortunately failed.
The two questions on which she was deemed untruthful were, are you certain Cameron came home at 1:30 a.m.? And are you covering up for your husband?
Whitney, we know you aren't being totally honest with us here.
Okay. Okay.
Whitney admits that Cameron's close relationship with Mika bothered her more than she initially let on.
She breaks down and admits, yes, it upset me that my husband went out with this woman.
In fact, she was really upset because she believed that Cameron had taken $20 from out of her pocket in order to go to the movies.
Imagine if someone used your hard-earned cash to buy another woman's movie ticket and popcorn. Right, it made my blood boil.
But Whitney maintains that Cameron did return home by 1:30 a.m.
She had stayed up until he arrived home at 1:30 in the morning because she was going to confront him about the money that he had stolen from her to take Mika out.
So after Cameron got home later that night after dropping off Mika, he and his wife had an argument.
The argument went on for a while until Cameron said he was done arguing and crawled into bed and went to sleep.
She woke at 10:30 in the morning. Cameron was in bed with her. She said, I'm a sound sleeper. I slept right through until 10:30 a.m. Well, if you were soundly asleep, how would you know if Cameron would have gotten up and left and returned home?
Mika was killed around 7:30 a.m. It's entirely possible that Cameron could have gone back to Mika's and killed her, and then snuck back into bed before his wife woke up.
After speaking with Whitney, detectives circle back around to Cameron and issue another polygraph test. Will he also show signs of deception?
During the polygraph examination, Cameron did pass some of the test questions. Questions where he works, where he lives, things of that nature.
Then, as the questions get related to the incident and more complicated, all of a sudden, he is found untruthful on two questions.
The first question is, were you present when Mika Wadley was injured? The second question was, did you have anything to do with the death of Mika Wadley?
He failed miserably on both those questions.
It's been looking more and more to investigators like they've zeroed in on their main suspect.
But Cameron insists they've got it all wrong.
When I continued to press him, he just continued to announce his innocence. I didn't do it. I was home.
You're wasting your time. I didn't do it.
All of this adding up is unsettling. His story felt very manufactured. And I felt like at that moment that I could have been looking at a killer.
Detectives take DNA and fingerprint samples from both Cameron and Whitney.
But once it's run through the lab and compared to the DNA at the crime scene, detectives are surprised to learn it was, in fact, not a match.
Are you sure?
There's no DNA from Cameron or his wife that's at the crime scene that's on Mika.
So now, they had to start from square one.
If Cameron wasn't involved, they can't rule out that this was a completely random crime.
So that was really what we were fearing, is that we had a serial rapist on our hands.
Despite the setback, investigators continue to diligently work on the case.
Our focus was still continuing to see, if not Cameron, then who? And we just continue to forge ahead and try to identify the person.
Police acquired a list of every known sex offender in the area, and they interviewed each one of them to make sure that they had a rock-solid alibi.
But their efforts prove unfruitful.
So days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and months turned into years, and the case became cold.
So, I mean, you can imagine how difficult this would be for Mika's family.
Beside being disappointed that they may never get justice, they're also worried about their own safety.
I'm scared to go in my own house because you have that in the head. Who is it? Is it someone I know? Am I talking to this person? Like, why? Like, I could be next to them.
As time drags on, Detective Kern eventually retires. But even in retirement, Mika's case stays on her mind.
I still kept kind of one foot in the door, would still ask the cold case, hey, how are we? Where are we with this? Is there anything more we can do?
She made a promise to the family that they would catch Mika's killer, and she wanted to make good on that promise.
And in 2020, 21 years after Mika's death, a new team of investigators starts making headway with the help of recent technological advances.
DNA technology had come a long way.
Parts of the fingernail clippings and ligatures that had not been tested was tested.
The new team also takes a look at the shoelace that was wrapped around Mika's hand, and they're able to find DNA from that shoelace. That's also the DNA from a male donor. The question now is, who is the donor? Where did this DNA come from?
To be perfectly transparent, throughout the whole 20 years, I believed it was Cameron.
But the new DNA samples still aren't a match for Cameron King or his wife.
I was speechless. All roads led to Cameron, and yet it wasn't Cameron. You could have knocked me down with a feather, honestly. Like, I was taken aback, just shocked.
One of the most shocking aspects of this case are the polygraph results, which is in contrast with the physical evidence. Even though the polygraph shows signs of deception, it's hard to argue with DNA evidence.
Most people don't understand what it's like to be inside of a police room, be asked questions. It's very stressful. It's very unnerving.
And it's quite possible the stress that Cameron was feeling in the interrogation room caused him to fail the polygraph test.
But even though investigators have hit a wall with their prime suspect, they continue to push on.
They started using public DNA databases, meaning 23andMe and all the ones where you put your own information and DNA in so you could find lost relatives.
Against all odds, they get a hit, and it was someone no one ever expected.
I'm like, what? For real? I know him.
Think about
21 years have passed since the murder of beloved single mother, Mika Wadley. But now detectives may finally have the lead they've been waiting for.
So after 20 years with the advances in technologies, detectives decided to reopen this case and to test DNA with new measures.
They started using public DNA databases, meaning 23andMe and all the ones where you put your own information and DNA in so you could find lost relatives.
Against all odds, they get a hit, and it was someone no one ever expected.
His name is Jerry Lee Henderson.
His name has never come up, not one time throughout this 20-year investigation.
Richmond Police Department contacted the family and showed a picture, and they asked, do you know the name of Jerry Lee Henderson? And at that time, they had no knowledge of anybody by that name.
And I told her I don't recognize the picture. I don't know him.
But Mika's best friend, Terry Adams, recognizes the name immediately.
Keela gave me a call and said, Terry, they found out who killed Mika. And I'm like, what? For real? And then she said it was a guy named Jerry Henderson. You know him? I'm like, yes, I know him.
Jerry Lee had attended some classes at junior college with Mika. He was kind of an acquaintance, but not anybody that she would speak of frequently.
We all went to Contra Costa College. We would just hang out, but I couldn't see the connection with Jerry and Mika because they weren't friends outside of us being all together.
Around the time Mika was killed, Jerry had been down on his luck.
He was having problems trying to have work and find a place to live. He'd actually been kicked out of his place.
He was homeless at some point.
So the million-dollar question is, why?
Why and how he ended up at her home that night.
So one theory that was put forward was that Jerry may have been coming to Mika's apartment in search of a place to stay because he had been kicked out.
So investigators believe he most likely snuck in through the window early in the morning, thinking Mika wasn't home. When he made it through the window and spotted Mika asleep, something in him must have snapped and decided he wanted more than just a place to stay.
Investigators believe he spotted her boots on the floor and quietly removed one of the shoelaces.
What are you doing? Let me go! Stop! Jerry, stop! So he binds her wrist and he's trying to sexually assault her.
But Mika fought back.
She's on the couch. She's pushing and she's fighting. She gave it her all.
That's why we have this evidence of this struggle. She must have fought really hard in order to make sure he wouldn't do what he was trying to do.
She bled pretty well from her defensive wounds.
All this while Mika was screaming at the top of her lungs, so loud that it woke her neighbor.
Mika!
When Jerry heard the knocks at the door, he began to panic.
He wraps her with the blanket really quick to quiet her.
But she wasn't quiet enough, so he smothered her.
Stop fighting. Shut up.
Mika fought her hardest, but unfortunately it wasn't enough to save her life.
But Mika's struggle, her fight, her tenacity prevented this perpetrator from sexually assaulting her. So if there's anything that the family can have some type of peace with, is that she was not sexually violated.
No one knows for sure if the man that Andrew Piper saw walking out of the apartment complex that day was Jerry, but it certainly seems likely.
Now that we have a name, and now that we have a DNA match, detectives want to speak to Jerry Lee Henderson.
But they find that they can't do that. They can't do that ever because Jerry Lee died 11 days after Mika's murder.
Although Jerry's cause of death was never confirmed, it appeared to be a drug overdose.
This is a bittersweet resolution that in some ways feels a little bit hollow because, we'll never be able to confront Jerry Lee Henderson and ask, why did you do this? What was your motivation?
Some of the answers we'll never have.
And unfortunately, Jerry Lee Henderson has taken that secret to his grave.
Mika's family is glad they have answers. However, a part of them still remains unconvinced.
That young man didn't do that. It don't make sense. It doesn't add up.
Jerry Henderson, he was the nicest guy. Jerry was really laid back and quiet. I just couldn't see what would do something like that.
They said he OD'd, but there ain't no drugs in his system. If you read it, that's what they said.
He didn't club. He didn't drink. He wasn't interested in the kind of stuff.
To be honest with you,
On a warm Sunday night in July, the streets of Toronto were glowing the way they always do in the middle of summer. Patios overflowed with laughter. Glasses clinked beneath strings of yellow lights. The smell of grilled meat, garlic, cigarette smoke, and sweet pastry drifted through the air along Danforth Avenue, where families wandered slowly after dinner and teenagers leaned against storefront windows pretending they had nowhere to be. It was the kind of night that makes a city feel immortal. Safe. Ordinary. Predictable. And maybe that was the cruelest part of what happened next. Because nobody on Danforth Avenue understood they were standing inside the final minutes of their old reality. At 10 p.m., the city was still breathing normally. By 10:10, people would be hiding beneath tables, pressing shaking hands against bullet wounds, screaming names into the dark, and running through pools of blood under neon restaurant signs. 10 minutes. That was all it took. 10 minutes to turn an ordinary Toronto evening into one of the most horrifying nights in modern Canadian history. Witnesses would later say the first sounds didn't register as gunfire. The cracks came sharp and fast, echoing against brick storefronts and apartment windows. Some people thought it was fireworks. Others thought construction equipment had exploded. A few didn't think at all. They simply froze, staring toward the noise with confused expressions that slowly transformed into terror as bodies began collapsing onto the sidewalk. One waitress remembered seeing wine glasses shatter before she understood why. Another witness described hearing screams before seeing the shooter. A father grabbed his daughter's arm and dragged her behind a parked car just seconds before bullets tore through the patio where they had been sitting. Somewhere in the chaos, a little girl lay dying. Somewhere else, an 18-year-old woman who had spent the evening with her friends would never make it home again. The shooter walked steadily through the neighborhood with a handgun in his hand, firing into crowds of strangers beneath the glow of restaurant lights. He did not shout. He did not issue demands. He moved with the cold momentum of someone disconnected from the humanity surrounding him. Every trigger pull scattered panic down another stretch of Danforth Avenue. Every second widened the radius of fear. Toronto police dispatchers became overwhelmed almost immediately. Calls poured in from horrified witnesses speaking over one another, voices cracking with confusion. People reported multiple shooters. Explosions. Terrorist attacks. Bodies on the pavement. Children bleeding. Nobody fully understood what was happening because events were unfolding too quickly for the human mind to organize them. 1 minute people were finishing dessert. The next they were crawling through broken glass trying to survive. Across the neighborhood, restaurant workers pulled strangers into kitchens and storage rooms. Some barricaded doors with chairs. Others hid silently beside freezers while gunshots echoed outside. Diners dropped to the floor beneath tables still covered in half-eaten meals. Phones buzzed endlessly as loved ones tried to reach family members trapped somewhere inside the violence. The city, so confident in its safety, suddenly discovered how fragile normal life truly was. And in the middle of it all walked a 29-year-old man named Faisal Hussein. Long before investigators would search his apartment. Long before journalists would dissect his past. Long before debates exploded across Canada about guns, radicalization, mental illness, policing, and public safety, there was simply this terrifying moment, a man moving through a crowded neighborhood firing at random human beings under the summer sky. To understand why this case shook Canada so deeply, you have to understand the mythology Canadians often tell themselves about violence. For decades, cities like Toronto carried an international reputation for safety. Americans looked north and saw stability, civility, restraint. Gun massacres were tragedies that happened elsewhere. They belonged to another country's headlines. Another culture's nightmares. Canada mourned mass shootings before, but there remained a stubborn belief that public spaces in cities like Toronto were fundamentally secure. Danforth Avenue represented that belief perfectly. Greektown was alive, multicultural, loud, joyful. Families walked there late into the evening without fear. Teenagers gathered there after movies. Couples sat shoulder to shoulder on crowded patios under warm summer air. The neighborhood embodied community. Which is exactly why the attack felt like a wound carved directly into the city's identity. Survivors would later describe the transformation of the street in haunting detail. One moment there was music drifting from restaurants. The next came screaming and silence punctuated by gunshots. A woman hiding behind a concrete planter remembered seeing abandoned shoes scattered across the sidewalk after crowds fled. A bartender described customers leaving phones, wallets, purses, and meals behind as they sprinted for cover. One witness said the street looked like a war zone illuminated by patio lanterns. Another remembered hearing a child cry for help somewhere in the darkness but being too terrified to move. Fear changed the environment instantly. Familiar storefronts became hiding places. Patio furniture became shields. Decorative flower pots became barriers between life and death. Every object on Danforth Avenue suddenly carried survival value. The attack lasted roughly 10 minutes, but trauma distorts time. For those trapped there, seconds stretched endlessly. Witnesses described feeling detached from reality, as if watching scenes from a film instead of their own lives collapsing around them. One man recalled locking eyes with the shooter from across the street and feeling his body stop functioning for a split second. Another survivor remembered trying to call 911 while her fingers shook so violently she could barely unlock her phone. Parents threw themselves over children. Friends dragged wounded strangers across sidewalks slick with spilled drinks and blood. Somewhere in the confusion, police officers raced toward danger without fully understanding what awaited them. They arrived to scenes of panic unlike anything many had experienced before. Civilians ran in every direction. Gunfire echoed between buildings. Reports remained inconsistent. Was there one shooter? Several. Was this terrorism? A gang attack? Nobody knew. Officers moved through crowds searching for the source while trying not to hit civilians in the process. Then, near Bowden Street, the violence reached its final confrontation. The gunman exchanged fire with police before turning the weapon on himself. Just like that, the shooting stopped. But the nightmare did not end. Because once the gunfire faded, reality settled over the neighborhood piece by piece. Sirens multiplied. Ambulances crowded intersections. Officers sealed off streets with yellow tape while terrified survivors stumbled through scenes illuminated by flashing emergency lights. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the humid night air. Blood stained the pavement outside restaurants where people had been laughing only minutes earlier. Phones continued ringing in the pockets of victims who could no longer answer them. Somewhere nearby, parents would soon learn their child was dead. Somewhere else, a family would stare at a hospital doctor trying to process words that no longer sounded real. 10-year-old Juliana Kozis had been out for ice cream with her family. Reese Fallon had been spending time with friends before preparing to begin university that fall. Their lives intersected with Faisal Hussein for only a few terrible seconds. That was all fate required. In the aftermath, Toronto searched desperately for explanations. People always do after acts of random violence. The human mind rejects chaos. We want motives, clear narratives, understandable evil. Investigators began tearing apart Hussein's background almost immediately, searching for warning signs buried within the ruins of his life. What they discovered only deepened the unease surrounding the case. There were reports of severe mental illness, accounts of psychosis and depression, questions about online extremism, speculation about misogynistic incel ideology. Then came another chilling complication. The Islamic State claimed responsibility for the attack through its propaganda channels, though Canadian authorities later stated they found no evidence proving direct operational ties. The result was a case wrapped in uncertainty. Even years later, the full truth remained elusive. And maybe that uncertainty is what makes this story so disturbing. There is no single explanation clean enough to contain the horror. No simple narrative capable of restoring order. Instead, the Danforth shooting exists at the intersection of mental illness, social isolation, fear, violence, ideology, and systemic failure. It forces impossible questions. How does a human being deteriorate to the point where he can calmly fire into crowds of strangers? What warning signs were missed? Could this have been prevented? And perhaps most terrifying of all, How many other people are walking silently through cities carrying storms nobody else can see? In the weeks after the attack, flowers covered Danforth Avenue. Candles flickered beside photographs of the victims. Strangers embraced during vigils while reporters broadcast live beneath handwritten messages demanding answers. The city mourned publicly, but beneath the grief sat something colder: anxiety. Toronto had already been traumatized earlier that same year by the deadly Yonge Street van attack. Now another mass casualty event shattered the illusion that such violence was rare. People began scanning crowded spaces differently. Loud noises triggered panic. Restaurant patios no longer felt entirely harmless. Parents held children closer. The atmosphere of the city changed in subtle ways difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Fear had entered places where comfort once lived. But before the investigations, before the political debates, before the headlines and courtroom discussions and psychological profiles, there was simply a street on a summer night. A neighborhood alive with ordinary people. A child eating dessert. Friends laughing over dinner. Couples finishing drinks under patio lights. Then came the sound of gunfire echoing through Greektown. And for 10 horrifying minutes, one man transformed an ordinary evening into a scene Canada would never forget. Toronto in the summer of 2018 felt alive in a way only great cities can. The streets breathed long after sunset. Construction cranes hung over the skyline like permanent fixtures of ambition while thousands of people poured through downtown sidewalks beneath glowing condo towers and streetcar wires. On warm nights, the city seemed to stretch endlessly outward, neighborhood after neighborhood stitched together by restaurants, late-night cafes, crowded bars, corner stores, and apartment balconies lit softly against the dark. It was multicultural, restless, loud, imperfect, and deeply proud of itself. Toronto sold an image to the world, a city where different cultures existed side by side without the fractures consuming so many other places. People called it safe, modern, progressive, a city of neighborhoods. And nowhere reflected that identity more clearly than Danforth Avenue. The Danforth was not glamorous in the polished way tourists imagined major cities should be. It wasn't lined with luxury boutiques or towering skyscrapers. Its beauty came from texture, from humanity, from the rhythm of ordinary life unfolding in public. Greek restaurants stood shoulder to shoulder beside cafes, bakeries, barbershops, convenience stores, family businesses, and old apartment buildings whose balconies overlooked the constant movement below. Elderly men sat outside coffee shops smoking cigarettes and arguing softly in Greek while teenagers carrying bubble tea drifted between crowds of families and couples out for dinner. Music spilled from open restaurant doors during summer evenings. The smell of roasted lamb, garlic, baked bread, sweet pastries, and strong coffee lingered permanently in the air. Greektown was the kind of place where strangers still made eye contact. Where restaurant owners recognized returning customers. Where people walked slowly because there was no reason to rush. On Sunday evenings, especially in July, Danforth Avenue transformed into something almost cinematic. The heat from the day lingered on the pavement even after sunset. Patio tables filled early and remained crowded late into the night. Servers weaved between tables carrying trays balanced with grilled seafood, wine glasses, plates of pasta, and desserts melting in the humid air. The street itself glowed beneath storefront lights and passing traffic. People laughed loudly there. Not performative laughter, but the relaxed kind that rises naturally when people feel safe. It was the kind of environment where parents allowed children to stay out later than usual because summer nights felt endless and harmless. That illusion of harmlessness mattered. Because what happened on July 22nd did not occur in isolation. The city was already emotionally exhausted before the first bullet was fired on Danforth Avenue. Earlier that same year, Toronto had suffered another devastating public attack when a rented van accelerated into pedestrians along Yonge Street, killing multiple people and injuring many others. The city had spent months trying to emotionally recover from images of bodies scattered across sidewalks in broad daylight. Public anxiety lingered beneath everyday life even when people pretended otherwise. Conversations about violence, radicalization, mental illness, and misogyny had already entered the national atmosphere. Toronto was still healing when another nightmare arrived. Yet despite that lingering tension, most residents still believed certain places remained untouchable. Danforth Avenue was one of them. Greek Town represented community. Families gathered there after church services. Students met friends there after classes. Couples celebrated anniversaries beneath patio lights. Children ate ice cream while musicians played nearby on summer nights. Violence belonged elsewhere. Not here. Not among crowded restaurant patios and families pushing strollers beneath warm evening skies. That belief created the emotional shockwave that followed the attack. Because when violence invades places people emotionally categorize as safe, the damage extends beyond the immediate victims. It attacks the psychological foundation of ordinary life itself. To understand the atmosphere surrounding the Danforth shooting, you also have to understand the broader tension simmering beneath Toronto in 2018. The city was growing rapidly. Housing prices had exploded. Downtown neighborhoods changed almost overnight as glass condominiums replaced older communities. Economic pressure weighed heavily on younger residents. Social media amplified loneliness while creating illusions of connection. Conversations about masculinity, alienation, online extremism, and mental health were becoming impossible to ignore. Across North America, mass shootings had become horrifyingly familiar. Each tragedy generated the same cycle of grief, outrage, political debate, and eventual exhaustion. Canadians often watched those events from a psychological distance, believing their country somehow remained insulated from that level of violence. But cracks in that confidence had already begun to appear. Gun violence in Toronto had increased noticeably in the years leading up to 2018. Police investigations linked many shootings to gang conflicts, illegal firearm trafficking, and organized crime. Yet even as statistics rose, random mass violence still felt improbable to many residents. Shootings happened in targeted contexts, people told themselves. Certain neighborhoods. Certain circles. Certain risks. The Danforth attack shattered that comforting narrative instantly because the victims appeared entirely random. There was no warning. No connection. No clear target profile. Just ordinary people enjoying a summer evening. The emotional geography of fear changed overnight. While the city moved through these tensions, another life unfolded quietly in the background. A man named Faisal Hussein drifted through Toronto carrying struggles most strangers never saw. Born in 1989, Hussein grew up in a family environment that outwardly resembled countless immigrant households across the city. His parents had worked hard to build stability in Canada. They valued education, discipline, and opportunity. By many accounts, the family initially appeared ordinary from the outside. But behind closed doors, serious problems developed over time. Relatives and family members would later describe years of deteriorating mental health, psychosis, depression, isolation, emotional instability. There were reports of hospitalizations and treatment attempts, medications, crises, family concern. Yet like many stories involving severe mental illness, the timeline remained fragmented and painfully complicated. Neighbors who encountered Hussein casually often remembered little remarkable about him. Some described him as quiet. Others recalled awkward interactions or moments of visible discomfort. He did not outwardly resemble the image many people associate with public violence. That is often the unsettling reality after mass casualty attacks. The perpetrators frequently appear ordinary enough to disappear into crowds before violence suddenly reveals what had been hidden beneath the surface. As investigators later reconstructed Hussein's life, they encountered contradictions everywhere. There were signs of severe psychiatric distress. But there were also online behaviors raising darker questions about ideology and resentment. Authorities examined whether he consumed extremist propaganda. They explored possible connections to misogynistic incel culture, particularly because the Yonge Street van attacker earlier that year had openly embraced those beliefs. Yet definitive conclusions remained elusive. Some experts argued mental illness alone could not explain the attack. Others warned against oversimplifying complex psychiatric conditions into narratives of inevitable violence. The public wanted certainty, but certainty never fully arrived. And uncertainty creates fear because people struggle to defend themselves against threats they cannot clearly define. In the days before July 22nd, Toronto continued moving through ordinary summer routines, unaware that another trauma was approaching. Restaurants prepared for evening crowds. Children attended camps and summer activities. Couples planned dinners downtown. Tourists wandered through Kensington Market, the harbourfront, and Chinatown beneath humid skies. On Danforth Avenue specifically, businesses expected another profitable summer weekend. Patio reservations filled quickly. Ice cream shops stayed busy late into the evening. Staff members prepared for long shifts serving crowds escaping their apartments to enjoy the warm weather. Nothing about the neighborhood suggested impending catastrophe. And maybe that normality is essential to understanding the horror. Violence of this kind rarely announces itself dramatically beforehand. Cities do not dim their lights in anticipation. There are no warning sirens hanging over restaurants. Life continues with stubborn confidence right until the instant it doesn't. On the evening of July 22nd, people arrived on Danforth Avenue carrying entirely ordinary concerns. Teenagers worried about relationships and university applications. Parents negotiated bedtime rules with children eager to enjoy summer freedom a little longer. Servers focused on tips and crowded sections. Friends debated music, politics, work, sports, vacations. Some people were celebrating birthdays. Others were simply trying to enjoy the final hours of the weekend before Monday returned everyone to routine. The future still existed normally for them. Plans remained intact. Tomorrow still felt guaranteed. Reese Fallon was among those young people standing at the edge of adulthood. At 18 years old, she represented the hopeful momentum of someone preparing to step fully into independent life. Friends described her as bright, warm, and deeply loved. She had dreams stretching ahead of her the way all teenagers do before reality teaches them how fragile time actually is. On that Sunday night, she was simply spending time with friends in a neighborhood that felt safe. 10-year-old Juliana Kozes was even younger, still living in the protected emotional universe of childhood. Ice cream outings with family. Summer evenings. Familiar streets. She should have had decades ahead of her. Those futures would vanish within minutes. Yet before tragedy claimed them, Danforth Avenue still looked beautiful. The city still hummed with ordinary life. Streetcars rattled through intersections. Music drifted from open windows. Condensation slid down cold glasses on crowded patios while strangers brushed past one another beneath restaurant lights. People laughed loudly enough to drown out traffic. Somewhere nearby, someone probably took photographs believing they were capturing another happy summer night worth remembering. And in a cruel way, they were. Because what makes places like Danforth Avenue meaningful is precisely their ordinariness. The attack did not target politicians, celebrities, or institutions of power. It struck at the center of everyday civilian life. Families, friends, children, public joy itself. That is why the memory lingered so powerfully across Canada. The violence contaminated something psychologically sacred, the belief that ordinary evenings in familiar neighborhoods remain fundamentally safe. By the time the sun disappeared completely over Toronto that night, the patios along Danforth Avenue were crowded. The restaurants buzzed with conversation. People leaned back in chairs enjoying the warmth of summer darkness settling over the city. And somewhere nearby, unseen among thousands of strangers moving through Toronto, Faisal Hussein was approaching the final hours of his life. The city did not know it yet, but another wound was already moving toward its heart. Before the shooting turned their names into headlines, before television crews stood beneath candlelight memorials repeating statistics about the dead and injured, Reese Fallon and Juliana Kozes were simply people living ordinary lives inside a city that never imagined it would lose them so violently. That is the cruelty hidden inside mass casualty attacks. News reports reduce victims to numbers almost immediately. 2 dead. 13 injured. Another tragedy. Another city in mourning. But behind every number is a life filled with routines, private dreams, unfinished conversations, favorite songs, bad habits, people who loved them, and futures that once felt limitless. The Danforth shooting shattered many lives in 10 minutes, but for two families, time divided permanently into before and after. Before July 22nd, and everything that came after it. Reese Fallon was 18 years old, standing at the fragile edge between adolescence and adulthood where life still feels unwritten. She had recently graduated from Malvern Collegiate Institute, one of Toronto's oldest high schools, and the future stretched in front of her with the uncertain excitement that belongs only to young people who still believe there is enough time for everything. Friends described her as artistic, compassionate, and deeply emotionally intuitive. She was the kind of person who noticed when someone felt excluded in a group conversation and quietly brought them back in. The kind of friend who stayed after class to help someone finish a project. The kind of daughter whose presence softened the atmosphere inside her home simply by walking into a room. People close to Reese often spoke about her creativity first. She loved art, photography, writing, music. She carried the emotional sensitivity common in people who observe the world carefully rather than rushing through it. Teachers remembered her as thoughtful and intelligent, but not arrogant about it. She listened more than she spoke. When she laughed, friends said, it felt genuine and uncontrollable, the kind that spread through entire groups until everyone else started laughing too. She had recently been accepted into university and was preparing to begin the next chapter of her life that fall. Like many teenagers during the final summer before adulthood, she existed in a strange emotional space between nostalgia and anticipation. Childhood had not fully disappeared yet, but independence was approaching fast. There were conversations about future plans, classes, dorms, jobs, relationships, travel. Endless possibilities still floated around her life untouched by reality. On the evening of July 22nd, Reese was spending time with friends on Danforth Avenue, doing exactly what thousands of young people do during summer weekends in Toronto. There was nothing unusual about it. Nothing reckless. Nothing dangerous. Just another warm night in the city. She had no way of knowing that ordinary decision would become fatal. Somewhere else in Toronto that same evening, 10-year-old Juliana Kozes was enjoying the innocence of childhood in its purest form. Juliana loved dance. She loved swimming. She loved animals and cartoons and spending time with her family. Her world was still organized around small joys, desserts after dinner, family outings, laughter in the backseat of a car, excitement over tiny future plans adults might consider insignificant but children treat as monumental. To understand the horror of losing a child, you have to understand how much future exists inside them. A 10-year-old is unfinished possibility. Every family photograph becomes painful because every image contains years that were supposed to happen but never will. Juliana had spent that Sunday evening with her family on Danforth Avenue. They had gone out together during one of those warm summer nights that parents later replay endlessly in their minds after tragedy arrives. The ordinary details become unbearable. What shoes was she wearing? What did she say in the car? Did anyone hug her before leaving home? Did she know she was loved? Families who lose children often become trapped inside microscopic memories because the brain desperately searches for moments it failed to recognize as final. Juliana's parents would later face the impossible reality of returning home without their daughter after leaving the house believing they were simply going out for a pleasant evening together. Friends and family remembered Juliana as bright, energetic, affectionate. She carried the natural curiosity many children possess before the world teaches caution and fear. She loved being around people. Teachers described her as kind-hearted and enthusiastic. She still lived in the emotional universe where adults are supposed to keep terrible things away from children. That trust would be shattered permanently not only for her family but for countless parents across Toronto after the attack. Because one of the most disturbing aspects of the Danforth shooting was how random it felt. No warning. No personal connection. No identifiable reason why one child survived while another did not. While Reese and Juliana moved through their final day unaware of what waited ahead, the families surrounding them were living entirely ordinary lives. Reese's loved ones likely discussed university plans, future ambitions, all the conversations families naturally have with young adults preparing to enter a new stage of life. There was excitement in those discussions. Pride. Maybe concern too, because parents always worry when children begin stepping into adulthood. But underneath everything sat an assumption so fundamental nobody even says it aloud: there will be more time. More dinners. More conversations. More birthdays. Human beings build their emotional lives around the expectation of continuity. Mass violence destroys that expectation instantly. Juliana's family likely experienced something softer and simpler that evening. Family outings with children often revolve around small negotiations and routines. What flavor ice cream to choose? Whether bedtime can be extended because it's summer. Conversations interrupted by laughter or distractions. Tiny moments no outsider would ever notice. That is what makes public tragedies so invasive. Violence interrupts lives while they are still unfolding normally. There is no dramatic preparation. No emotional farewell scene. People are stolen directly out of ordinary existence. Across Danforth Avenue that night, countless other lives intersected unknowingly with Reese and Juliana. Restaurant workers moving between tables. Couples sharing drinks. Friends taking photographs. Children pulling parents toward dessert shops. Some survivors would later realize they had walked past the victims minutes before the shooting began without understanding they were witnessing the final peaceful moments of those lives. Trauma changes memory afterward. Survivors replay ordinary details, obsessively searching for meaning inside randomness. Investigators later reconstructed timelines with painful precision. Where victims stood. Which direction they ran. How many seconds existed between the first gunshots and fatal wounds? But timelines cannot capture emotional reality. They cannot explain the terror of parents seeing a child collapse in front of them. They cannot fully describe the confusion of friends trying to understand why someone who had been laughing moments earlier was suddenly bleeding on the pavement. They cannot measure the permanent psychological damage left inside witnesses who survived physically but carried those images forever afterward. Reese Fallon's death struck many people particularly hard because she symbolized youth in transition. She represented possibility interrupted. Teachers and classmates spoke publicly about her intelligence, empathy, and artistic spirit because they struggled to reconcile the idea that someone so full of future could disappear so senselessly. Her death carried the emotional weight of stolen potential. The world often reacts strongly to young victims because they remind people how fragile human plans truly are. University applications. Career dreams. Relationships not yet formed. Entire decades erased in seconds by someone she had never met. Friends described the surreal experience of hearing about the shooting and desperately trying to contact her before realizing she would never answer. That moment repeats itself after every modern tragedy. Phones buzzing endlessly. Messages unread. Families cycling between hope and dread while hospitals struggle to identify victims and notify loved ones. Technology creates cruel emotional limbo during disasters because communication usually means survival. Silence becomes terrifying. For Juliana's family, the grief carried a different but equally devastating shape. The death of a child ruptures reality itself for parents. There is no emotional framework capable of making such loss feel natural or understandable. Parents are biologically and psychologically constructed to protect children. When violence destroys that instinctive order, survivors often describe feeling disconnected from reality afterward, as though the universe itself has malfunctioned. Juliana's death transformed an ordinary family outing into a lifelong trauma that would echo through every future birthday, holiday, school year, and quiet moment inside their home. Her absence would remain permanent while the world around them continued moving forward indifferent to their grief. The surviving victims of the Danforth shooting also carried stories often overshadowed by the fatalities. 13 people suffered gunshot wounds that night. Some survived with lasting physical injuries. Others carried psychological trauma difficult to articulate publicly. Survivors of random violence frequently struggle with guilt. Why did I survive when others died? Why did one bullet miss me while another struck someone beside me? These questions rarely have answers, but the human mind searches for them endlessly anyway. One survivor later described hearing gunshots and initially believing someone had dropped construction materials nearby. Another remembered diving beneath a table while strangers screamed around her. A restaurant employee recalled dragging customers into hiding while bullets shattered windows outside. The randomness of survival haunted many witnesses afterward. A few inches. A delayed step. A different table choice. Tiny variables determined who lived and who died. That randomness leaves deep psychological scars because it destroys the comforting illusion that life follows predictable rules. In the aftermath of the shooting, memorials appeared quickly along Danforth Avenue. Flowers covered sidewalks. Candles flickered beneath photographs of Reese and Juliana. Handwritten notes from strangers expressed grief, anger, confusion, and solidarity. Some messages addressed the victims directly as though speaking to them could somehow bridge the unbearable distance death created. Others focused on the city itself, pleading for healing or demanding change. Toronto residents visited the memorials not only to mourn the dead but also to process their own shaken sense of safety. People stared at the faces of Reese and Juliana, trying to emotionally comprehend how ordinary lives become symbols overnight. Yet perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of victimhood in cases like this is how quickly public attention eventually fades. News cycles move on. Political debates evolve. Statistics replace names. But families remain trapped inside grief long after cameras disappear. Reese Fallon's loved ones would continue imagining the adulthood she never reached. Juliana Koziz's family would continue living with the silence left behind by a missing child. Friends would continue experiencing sudden moments where memory collides painfully with reality. A song. A photograph. A familiar street. An inside joke nobody else remembers. Grief survives in fragments. The Danforth shooting became part of Canada's broader conversation about violence, guns, mental illness, and public safety. But before it became a national issue, it was personal devastation. A young woman preparing for university. A little girl enjoying summer with her family. Human lives interrupted permanently by 10 minutes of terror on a warm Toronto night. And somewhere beneath all the political arguments and investigative theories that followed, those losses remained the emotional center of the story. Because long after people stop debating motives and policy failures, two families still wake up every morning in a world missing someone they loved. At 9:56 p.m., Danforth Avenue still felt normal. The patios were crowded. Streetcars rolled past slowly beneath overhead wires, their windows glowing against the summer darkness. Restaurant staff moved quickly between tables carrying plates of grilled seafood, beer, wine, and desserts while conversations blended together into the warm nighttime noise of the city. Children tugged at parents' sleeves asking for ice cream before bedtime. Couples leaned close over candlelit tables. Music drifted through open restaurant doors. Nothing about the street suggested that within minutes people would be crawling across pavement trying to survive. Somewhere along Danforth Avenue, Faisal Hussein was already moving toward the neighborhood carrying a loaded Smith & Wesson M&P .40 caliber handgun. Witnesses would later struggle to describe him because there was nothing immediately dramatic about his appearance. No mask. No screaming. No theatrical declaration of hatred. He moved through the city like countless other pedestrians walking alone at night. That ordinariness made the violence more terrifying. Evil rarely announces itself clearly before it strikes. At approximately 10 p.m., near the intersection of Danforth and Logan, the first gunshots cracked through the humid Toronto air. The sound echoed sharply between storefronts and apartment buildings. For a split second, many people did not react. Summer cities produce endless noise. Fireworks. Car backfires. Construction sounds. People laughed through the first shots because their brains had not yet translated the noise into danger. Then glass shattered. Someone screamed. A body collapsed onto the sidewalk. And reality changed instantly. Hussein began firing into crowds of strangers with terrifying speed. He moved westward along Danforth Avenue, shooting at people sitting on restaurant patios, walking along sidewalks, or standing near storefronts. There was no visible pattern. No confrontation. No argument preceding the violence. Just sudden, random gunfire exploding into ordinary life. Witnesses later described seeing flashes from the handgun as patrons dove beneath tables and chairs overturned across patios. One woman remembered hearing what sounded like popping balloons before seeing blood spread across a stranger's shirt. Another survivor described the sensation of confusion turning into primal terror almost instantly. The human mind resists believing catastrophe is real until survival instinct takes control. Across the street, people began running in every direction. Some sprinted blindly away from the gunfire without knowing where the shooter actually was. Others froze completely, paralyzed by shock. Restaurant workers shouted for customers to get down while dragging terrified people through kitchens and storage areas. Chairs scraped violently across concrete patios as crowds collapsed beneath tables seeking cover behind furniture never designed to stop bullets. Hussein continued walking steadily forward. Witnesses later noted how calm he appeared during the attack. That detail haunted many survivors afterward. There was no visible panic in his movements. No hesitation. He fired methodically into crowded public spaces beneath glowing restaurant signs while people screamed around him. At Christina's restaurant, customers dropped to the floor as bullets tore through windows and patio seating. At nearby businesses, diners crawled desperately toward bathrooms, kitchens, anywhere hidden from the street. Some people sheltered strangers with their own bodies. Others grabbed children and ran without looking back. In those moments, social order dissolved into raw survival instinct. A father threw himself over his daughter near a restaurant patio. A waitress pulled injured customers behind a counter while trying not to look at the blood spreading across the floor. Friends lost each other in the chaos and began screaming names into crowds already consumed by panic. The gunfire moved fast. Faster than most witnesses could emotionally process. Hussein advanced westward along Danforth, firing repeatedly. Bullets shattered windows, struck storefronts, ricocheted off pavement. One witness later described hearing metal clang as rounds struck street fixtures nearby. Another survivor remembered diving behind a parked vehicle while trying to understand whether multiple shooters were involved. Confusion spread almost as rapidly as fear. Modern mass shootings create sensory overload. People struggle to determine direction, location, scale. Sounds echo unpredictably through urban environments. Rumors emerge instantly. Someone shouted there were terrorists everywhere. Another person screamed that gunmen were inside the restaurants. Others believed gangs had opened fire nearby. Nobody truly understood the situation because the violence unfolded too quickly for coherent understanding. Meanwhile, emergency dispatch centers became overwhelmed with calls. Terrified witnesses spoke over one another trying to explain what they were seeing. Reports came in fragmented and contradictory. Shots fired. Multiple victims. Children hit. People down outside restaurants. The operators struggled to gather accurate information while panic consumed the neighborhood. Police officers rushed toward Danforth Avenue without fully knowing what awaited them. Some responding units feared coordinated terrorism because of the scale and randomness of the attack. Others worried there could be multiple active shooters moving through crowds. On Danforth Avenue itself, terror spread block by block. One restaurant patron later recalled hearing screaming before seeing dozens of people suddenly running toward him. Another witness remembered the chilling sight of abandoned meals still sitting on tables after customers fled for cover. Wine glasses shattered across patios. Phones, purses, shoes, and jackets littered sidewalks where people had escaped seconds earlier. The atmosphere transformed from vibrant summer nightlife into a battlefield in less than a minute. Reese Fallon was among those caught in the violence. Somewhere in the chaos of fleeing crowds and exploding gunfire, the 18-year-old was struck fatally. Friends near her likely struggled to comprehend what had happened because death during ordinary social outings feels psychologically impossible at first. One moment someone is beside you laughing beneath restaurant lights. The next they are collapsing onto concrete while strangers scream and run. Trauma experts often describe these moments as cognitive rupture. Reality stops making sense fast enough for the brain to emotionally process it. Juliana Kozis was also caught in the attack while out with her family. 10 years old. A child enjoying summer with people she trusted to keep her safe. Witnesses later described scenes of parents carrying injured children through crowds searching desperately for help. The emotional horror of a child shot in the middle of a family outing intensified public grief afterward because it represented the complete destruction of innocence within a place people associated with safety and joy. As Hussein continued firing, survivors began making impossible decisions under extreme stress. Hide or run. Help the wounded or protect family members first. Stay silent or call for help. Some people locked themselves inside restaurant bathrooms listening to gunfire outside while texting loved ones goodbye messages because they believed they might die. Others crouched behind planters, vehicles, or concrete structures praying bullets would miss them. Witnesses later recalled hearing continuous screams mixed with the sharp popping sound of gunfire echoing through the street. Police officers arriving on scene encountered immediate chaos. Civilians ran toward them covered in blood and panic, shouting conflicting information. Some pointed west. Others east. Officers advanced cautiously through crowds trying to identify the shooter while avoiding civilians diving for cover around them. The unpredictability of urban active shooter situations creates enormous danger for responding police. Every movement becomes uncertain. Every shadow potentially lethal. Somewhere near Bowden Street, officers finally encountered Hussein directly. What followed happened quickly. Gunfire erupted between police and the shooter as terrified civilians fled nearby intersections. Witnesses described hearing another burst of shots before sudden silence settled briefly over the street. Hussein ultimately turned the handgun on himself. Within approximately 10 minutes of the first shots, the attack was over. But the aftermath had only begun. Silence after mass violence often feels unnatural. Survivors later described hearing distant sirens growing louder while shock settled across the neighborhood. People emerged slowly from hiding places, unsure whether the danger had truly ended. Restaurant workers stepped onto sidewalks transformed into scenes of devastation. Injured victims lay beside overturned chairs and shattered glass. Blood spread across pavement still warm from the summer heat. Some wounded victims cried out for help while others remained terrifyingly silent. Emergency responders flooded the area within minutes. Ambulances lined intersections. Police officers sealed streets with yellow tape while paramedics rushed between victims performing triage beneath flashing lights. Witnesses watched medics kneeling beside bodies outside restaurants where people had been eating dinner moments earlier. The contrast between ordinary nightlife and catastrophic violence felt surreal. One survivor later described seeing half-finished plates of food sitting untouched beside pools of blood. Phones rang endlessly from victims' pockets as family members and friends desperately tried to make contact. Parents searched frantically through crowds for missing children. Friends screamed names at police barricades hoping someone would answer. Inside nearby hospitals, emergency departments prepared for incoming gunshot victims as doctors and nurses scrambled to respond. Medical staff would later describe the emotional difficulty of treating victims from a mass casualty event involving children and random civilians. Outside trauma centers, families gathered waiting for information while fear spread across the city through social media and live news broadcasts. Rumors multiplied rapidly online. Reports of terrorism circulated before investigators confirmed details. Some witnesses believed there had been multiple shooters because of how quickly panic spread. Others uploaded videos capturing fragments of gunfire and screaming crowds fleeing through Greektown. Toronto residents watching from home experienced the terrifying realization that another mass attack had struck their city only months after the Yonge Street van killings. Across Danforth Avenue, the emotional devastation deepened as identities of the victims slowly emerged. Reese Fallon was pronounced dead. Juliana Kozis later died from her injuries. 13 others survived gunshot wounds carrying physical and psychological scars that would remain long after news coverage faded. Survivors sat wrapped in emergency blankets on sidewalks while investigators moved through the crime scene marking shell casings and bloodstains beneath restaurant lights. Some witnesses remained too shocked to speak clearly. Others repeated fragmented memories over and over, trying to organize trauma into coherent narrative. The neighborhood itself looked transformed. Police tape stretched across intersections. Patio furniture remained abandoned exactly where people had fled. Broken glass covered sidewalks. Emergency lights reflected off restaurant windows while reporters gathered nearby broadcasting live into the night. Residents standing behind barricades stared silently at scenes they never imagined witnessing in their own community. The Danforth they recognized, the lively, joyful neighborhood filled with music and crowded patios, had vanished temporarily beneath fear and grief. And somewhere in the middle of all that devastation sat the terrible truth investigators would spend months trying to understand. One man carrying a handgun had managed to turn an ordinary Toronto summer evening into national trauma in just 10 minutes. By 10:20 p.m., Danforth Avenue no longer resembled the lively summer neighborhood it had been less than half an hour earlier. The restaurant patios stood abandoned beneath flickering lights. Plates of untouched food remained scattered across tables where people had fled mid-conversation. Wine glasses lay shattered across the pavement alongside sandals, handbags, jackets, children's toys, and overturned chairs. The humid July air still carried traces of grilled food and cigarette smoke, but now another smell had settled over the street too, the metallic scent of blood mixed with burned gunpowder. Flashing emergency lights painted the storefronts red and blue while police officers forced crowds farther back behind hastily constructed barricades. Across several blocks of Danforth Avenue, panic was slowly hardening into reality. Survivors emerged from hiding places shaking uncontrollably, many unable to process what they had just witnessed. Some stumbled barefoot through broken glass because they had lost shoes while running. Others clutched strangers they had met only minutes earlier, holding on to human contact simply to keep themselves grounded. One woman sat on the curb staring blankly at blood covering her hands without realizing she had been trying to stop a victim's bleeding moments before. Nearby, a man repeatedly attempted to call his daughter while paramedics treated gunshot victims only feet away. The human brain struggles to absorb catastrophe all at once. Shock arrives first. Understanding comes later. The first officers on scene moved through chaos that still felt unstable and dangerous. In active shooter situations, uncertainty remains a threat even after gunfire stops. Police had to determine whether additional shooters existed, whether explosives were present, whether civilians remained in danger somewhere inside restaurants or nearby buildings. Officers entered businesses carefully, weapons drawn, shouting commands into kitchens, storage rooms, and washrooms where terrified people still hid in silence. Some survivors initially refused to come out because they believed the shooter might still be nearby. Others emerged with hands raised, crying hysterically, unable to distinguish police from danger after the confusion of the attack. Paramedics worked rapidly beneath impossible emotional pressure. Triage began almost immediately across multiple locations along the avenue. Some victims were conscious, screaming in pain or desperately asking about family members. Others were eerily silent. Medical responders knelt on sidewalks beside pools of blood trying to stabilize wounds under the harsh glow of emergency lights while crowds watched from behind police lines. The randomness of the injuries complicated everything. Victims ranged from children to older adults. Gunshot wounds affected different parts of the body with wildly varying severity. Every second mattered. Emergency personnel moved quickly but carefully, aware that panic and chaos could cost additional lives. Witnesses later described the scene as surreal. A waiter still wearing his apron helped carry stretchers toward ambulances. Restaurant owners handed bottles of water and towels to trembling survivors gathered outside their businesses. Complete strangers comforted crying children separated temporarily from parents during the stampede. In moments of collective trauma, social barriers often disappear. People stop caring who belongs to whom. Survival and compassion become instinctive. Yet beneath those acts of humanity sat overwhelming fear. Nobody fully understood why the attack had happened. Terrorism seemed possible. Coordinated violence seemed possible. Toronto was already emotionally raw from earlier tragedies that year, and many residents feared this was the beginning of something larger. Crime scene investigators began arriving shortly after the area was secured. Their task was methodical, almost clinical, despite the emotional devastation surrounding them. They photographed shell casings, measured trajectories, marked bloodstains, documented bullet impacts on restaurant windows and storefront walls. Tiny details mattered now. Every casing, every witness statement, every surveillance camera angle. Investigators moved carefully through the destruction while reporters gathered nearby, broadcasting images of flashing lights and armed police across national television. The Danforth shooting had already become international news before many victims' families even learned what happened. Shell casings littered sections of the avenue where Hussein had fired repeatedly into crowds. Investigators traced his movement block by block, reconstructing the attack through physical evidence and witness testimony. Security cameras from businesses captured fragments of the violence: crowds running, people diving for cover, the gunman moving through the street. Yet no video could fully communicate the terror experienced by those trapped there. Cameras flattened panic into images. Survivors carried the emotional reality inside their memories forever. Near one restaurant patio, investigators documented evidence connected to the fatal shooting of Reese Fallon. Nearby, another section of the scene marked where Juliana Cozes had been critically wounded. The emotional weight of child victims affects investigators deeply even when professionalism requires emotional control. Officers later acknowledged privately how difficult the scene had been. Mass casualty events involving random civilians create a specific kind of psychological damage for first responders because they force confrontation with pure unpredictability. There is no organized battlefield. No criminal negotiation. Just ordinary people destroyed during ordinary life. Hospitals across Toronto operated under emergency conditions throughout the night. Doctors treated gunshot victims while police officers guarded entrances and attempted to gather preliminary information from survivors stable enough to speak. Families crowded waiting rooms desperate for updates. Phones buzzed endlessly as friends and relatives tried to identify who had survived. Social media intensified the emotional chaos. Rumors spread faster than verified information. Some posts claimed multiple shooters remained at large. Others falsely identified suspects or exaggerated casualty numbers. Fear multiplied digitally across the city while authorities struggled to establish facts. Shortly after midnight, police publicly confirmed 2 fatalities and numerous injuries. The names of the victims were not released immediately, but families had already begun receiving devastating notifications behind closed doors. Somewhere in Toronto, Reese Fallon's loved ones were confronting the unimaginable reality that an 18-year-old preparing for university would never come home again. Elsewhere, Juliana Cozes's family faced every parent's worst nightmare. The private grief unfolding inside those homes existed separately from the media spectacle developing outside. Reporters focused on motives, suspects, terrorism possibilities, and public safety concerns. Families focused on impossible absence. Meanwhile, investigators turned their attention toward the dead gunman. Faisal Hussein's body became central to understanding the attack, but in those early hours authorities knew remarkably little about him. Officers searched for identification, background records, possible associates, ideological connections, anything capable of explaining why a man had opened fire into crowded restaurant patios on a Sunday night. His handgun immediately drew investigative attention as well. Canada maintains stricter firearm regulations than the United States, particularly regarding handguns. Investigators needed to determine where the weapon came from, whether it had been obtained legally, and whether broader criminal networks might be connected to the shooting. The firearm itself became an important clue because guns carry histories, ownership trails, smuggling patterns, criminal connections. Early findings suggested the handgun had been acquired illegally, intensifying debates already raging in Toronto about firearm trafficking across the US-Canada border. But in those first hours, certainty remained scarce. The attack's randomness created enormous pressure on investigators to identify motive quickly. Public fear escalates dramatically when violence appears senseless because unpredictability makes people feel defenseless. Authorities examined several possibilities simultaneously. Terrorism remained a major concern, especially given global trends involving lone attackers targeting civilians in public spaces. Yet investigators also explored mental illness, personal grievances, online radicalization, misogynistic extremism, and other psychological factors. The challenge was that evidence initially pointed in multiple directions without forming a clear narrative. Then another disturbing complication emerged. Less than 24 hours after the attack, the Islamic State released a statement claiming responsibility for the shooting through one of its propaganda channels. The announcement sent shockwaves through Canada and immediately intensified international media attention. If true, the Danforth shooting could represent another example of extremist-inspired violence striking a Western city. But investigators approached the claim cautiously. Terror organizations sometimes opportunistically attach themselves to attacks they had no operational involvement in simply to amplify fear and maintain relevance. Canadian authorities later stated they found no evidence proving direct communication or coordination between Hussein and ISIS. Still, the claim complicated public understanding of the case enormously. Fear thrives inside ambiguity. While federal agencies and Toronto police pursued leads, investigators also began examining Hussein's personal history more closely. What they found painted the outline of a deeply troubled life. Family members reportedly described years of severe mental health struggles, including psychosis and depression. There were accounts of treatment attempts, medications, emotional instability, and long-term suffering that had affected both Hussein and those around him. Investigators explored whether his deteriorating mental state alone could explain the attack or whether ideological influences had merged with psychological illness in dangerous ways. The distinction mattered not only legally but socially. Cities process violence differently depending on how they categorize perpetrators. Terrorist, mentally ill, extremist, criminal. Each label carries political consequences. Back on Danforth Avenue, daylight revealed the full visual aftermath of the attack more clearly. Crime scene tape still stretched across sections of the neighborhood while investigators continued collecting evidence beneath media helicopters circling overhead. Business owners arrived to inspect shattered windows and blood-stained sidewalks outside restaurants that normally symbolized joy and community. Some workers cried openly while staring at damaged patios where customers had been shot only hours earlier. Flowers began appearing near police barriers almost immediately. So did handwritten messages. Pray for Toronto. We stand together. Enough violence. People needed rituals to process fear. Memorials became emotional anchors for a shocked city. Witness interviews continued throughout the following days. Detectives reconstructed timelines with painstaking precision. Where exactly did Hussein begin firing? How many shots were fired? Which victims were struck first? Did the shooter say anything during the attack? Survivors provided fragmented memories shaped by trauma. Some recalled details with unnatural clarity: the color of a shirt, the sound of shell casings hitting pavement, the expression on another person's face. Others remembered almost nothing coherent beyond panic. Trauma disrupts memory unpredictably. Investigators had to separate perception from fact while respecting the emotional devastation witnesses endured. One recurring detail emerged consistently from survivor accounts: the speed of the violence. People repeatedly described how quickly ordinary life transformed into catastrophe. A conversation interrupted by gunfire. A dessert left unfinished. A child laughing seconds before screaming erupted nearby. Those abrupt transitions haunted survivors because the brain struggles to accept how thin the barrier between normality and horror truly is. In the days after the attack, Toronto entered a familiar modern ritual of mourning mixed with debate. Politicians promised action. Community leaders called for unity. Journalists examined gun laws, mental health systems, online extremism, and policing strategies. Yet underneath every discussion remained the physical reality investigators encountered that first night on Danforth Avenue: shattered glass beneath restaurant lights, blood on the pavement, terrified civilians running through summer darkness. And 2 lives permanently erased in 10 minutes of violence. The evidence told investigators how the attack happened. Understanding why would prove far more difficult. In the days following the Danforth shooting, Toronto existed inside a strange emotional atmosphere suspended somewhere between grief and paranoia. The city continued functioning because cities always do. Streetcars still rattled through intersections. Office workers still crowded downtown sidewalks every morning. Restaurants reopened. Children attended summer camps. But beneath those ordinary routines, something fundamental had shifted. People scanned crowded public spaces differently now. Sudden loud noises caused heads to turn. Conversations in cafes drifted inevitably back toward the shooting, toward fear, toward questions nobody could answer. Why had it happened? Who exactly was Faisal Hussein? And perhaps most disturbingly of all, could it happen again? Inside Toronto Police Headquarters, investigators faced enormous pressure to produce answers quickly. Public fear grows aggressively in the absence of explanation. Every unresolved mass attack creates a vacuum that rumors, speculation, and political agendas rush to fill. Detectives assigned to the case worked around the clock reconstructing Hussein's final movements, personal history, digital activity, and psychological condition. They examined surveillance footage frame by frame, interviewed witnesses repeatedly, pulled records from hospitals, social media accounts, phone data, financial transactions, and prior police interactions. The goal was simple in theory but terrifyingly difficult in practice: determine what transformed a 29-year-old man into someone capable of walking through a crowded Toronto neighborhood firing into strangers. Almost immediately, investigators encountered conflicting narratives surrounding Hussein. Some people who knew him casually described him as socially awkward but harmless. Quiet. Withdrawn. Uncomfortable in conversation. Others recalled behavior that seemed more troubling in retrospect. Emotional instability. Sudden mood shifts. Isolation. Family members reportedly described years of severe mental health struggles involving psychosis and depression. According to those close to him, Hussein had battled psychological illness for much of his adult life. There were reports of hospitalizations, treatment programs, medications, psychiatric interventions. Relatives later stated publicly that they had tried desperately to get him help over the years. Those early revelations pushed the investigation toward one possible explanation: severe untreated or unsuccessfully treated mental illness culminating in catastrophic violence. But almost immediately, that narrative became complicated. Investigators examining Hussein's online activity discovered material suggesting potential ideological influences as well. The timing of the attack intensified those concerns dramatically. Only 3 months earlier, Toronto had suffered the deadly Yonge Street van attack carried out by Alec Minassian, who openly identified with the online incel movement, a toxic internet subculture built around misogyny, resentment, social alienation, and violent fantasies directed primarily at women. Canada was already struggling to understand how online radicalization and male grievance culture could erupt into public violence. Investigators now wondered whether Hussein might have been influenced by similar ideologies. Detectives searched through digital histories looking for patterns. Forums. Social media posts. Search records. Communications. Any evidence capable of clarifying motive. The internet often becomes a psychological mirror for isolated individuals. Hidden resentments, obsessions, fantasies, and ideological influences surface there more openly than they do in face-to-face life. Investigators discovered troubling fragments but no single definitive explanation. Some material hinted at misogynistic thinking. Other evidence suggested severe psychological deterioration disconnected from coherent political ideology. The deeper investigators looked, the more fragmented the picture became. Then came the ISIS claim. Less than a day after the attack, the Islamic State's propaganda agency released a statement asserting that Hussein had been one of its soldiers. International media exploded immediately. Terrorism narratives dominated headlines. Experts debated whether Canada had suffered another extremist-inspired attack. The claim amplified public fear enormously because terrorism carries a uniquely destabilizing psychological effect. Random mass violence terrifies people. Ideological violence terrifies entire societies. Federal agencies joined the investigation aggressively, examining whether Hussein had direct communication with extremist networks, consumed radical propaganda, or pledged allegiance online before the shooting. Yet despite intense scrutiny, authorities failed to uncover convincing evidence linking him operationally to ISIS. No communication chains. No logistical coordination. No verified ideological declarations. Canadian investigators eventually stated publicly that the terrorist claim appeared unsupported by evidence. But by then, uncertainty had already contaminated public understanding of the case. People wanted a clean explanation. Instead, they received ambiguity. Mental illness. Online extremism. Social isolation. Possible ideological influence. None of it fit neatly together. That uncertainty frustrated investigators as much as the public. Modern acts of violence increasingly emerge from blurred psychological territory where ideology, personal grievance, mental illness, loneliness, and internet radicalization overlap chaotically. Investigators often search for a single clear motive because legal systems and media narratives function best with defined categories. But human behavior rarely obeys those categories cleanly. As detectives dug deeper into Hussein's background, they encountered a man whose life appeared marked by profound instability. Reports suggested he struggled to maintain employment and social relationships consistently. Some acquaintances described him as increasingly detached over time. Family members reportedly feared for his mental state long before the shooting occurred. Yet many questions remained unresolved. Had he specifically planned the attack for ideological reasons? Was the violence primarily the result of psychological collapse? Did he target Danforth Avenue intentionally, or was the location chosen randomly? Why did he attack strangers without speaking or making demands? Every answer investigators uncovered seemed to generate additional uncertainty. Meanwhile, public debate intensified across Canada. Gun control advocates pointed toward the handgun used in the shooting and demanded stricter regulations. Police sources indicated the weapon had likely been obtained illegally, reinforcing concerns about cross-border firearm trafficking from the United States into Canadian cities. Politicians argued over whether existing laws had failed or whether enforcement gaps mattered more than legislation itself. Yet others focused primarily on mental health infrastructure, asking how someone reportedly suffering years of severe psychiatric distress could deteriorate to such catastrophic violence. Mental health experts warned against simplistic assumptions linking psychiatric illness directly to mass shootings. The overwhelming majority of mentally ill individuals never commit violence. Yet cases like Hussein's created emotional confusion for the public because warning signs appeared visible in hindsight. Family concerns. Psychiatric struggles. Social withdrawal. People wanted to believe tragedies become preventable once enough red flags emerge. But reality often proves more frighteningly complicated. Across Toronto, survivors of the shooting tried to process trauma while investigators chased theories. Some witnesses struggled to sleep after hearing gunfire replay endlessly in their minds. Others avoided Danforth Avenue entirely. Restaurant workers returned reluctantly to businesses where blood had stained the sidewalks days earlier. Certain sounds triggered panic unexpectedly. Fireworks. Construction noise. Car backfires. Trauma rewires the nervous system quietly. Survivors carry the attack inside ordinary moments long after media attention fades. Detectives continued interviewing witnesses throughout the following weeks, searching for behavioral details that might clarify Hussein's mindset during the attack. Did he appear focused on specific targets? Did he say anything meaningful? Did his movements suggest planning? Many survivors described the same chilling observation. He seemed emotionally detached. Calm. Focused. Not frenzied or visibly enraged. That detail unsettled investigators because emotional detachment during violence sometimes indicates ideological commitment or psychological dissociation. But again, interpretation remained uncertain. Security footage offered limited insight. Hussein moved through Danforth Avenue, firing rapidly into crowds before encountering police near Bowden Street. The attack itself lasted roughly 10 minutes. There were no speeches. No manifesto discovered immediately afterward. No straightforward declaration explaining his intentions. Instead, investigators faced a mosaic of troubling possibilities overlapping imperfectly. The case also exposed broader societal discomfort surrounding male isolation and psychological deterioration. Hussein fit certain patterns increasingly discussed after mass violence incidents: social alienation, emotional instability, difficulty integrating socially, possible resentment, online withdrawal. Experts examining these patterns warned that modern societies often fail to identify dangerous psychological decline until catastrophe occurs. Individuals can deteriorate quietly inside crowded cities without meaningful intervention. Families struggle to obtain long-term psychiatric support. Communities miss warning signs. Online environments intensify grievance and emotional fragmentation. Yet identifying risk factors after violence occurs is easier than preventing violence beforehand. Retrospective clarity creates illusions of predictability that rarely exist in real time. Journalists investigating Hussein's background encountered another common challenge in mass shooting cases: people reinterpret memories after tragedy. Behaviors once dismissed as awkward suddenly appear sinister in hindsight. Ordinary isolation becomes ominous. Strange comments gain exaggerated significance. Human beings instinctively search backward for clues proving disaster was foreseeable because randomness feels intolerable. Some acquaintances emphasized Hussein's struggles with mental illness compassionately, portraying him as someone failed by inadequate systems. Others focused on the brutality of his actions and rejected explanations that sounded too sympathetic. Public conversation became polarized quickly because society often struggles to hold multiple truths simultaneously. A person can suffer profoundly and still commit horrifying violence. Compassion for suffering does not erase accountability for destruction. The investigation also explored whether Hussein intentionally targeted women or children, given similarities some commentators drew between the Danforth shooting and the misogynistic motivations behind the earlier van attack. But evidence again remained inconclusive. The victims appeared random overall. Men and women were both wounded. Families, couples, teenagers, restaurant workers all became targets. The absence of a clearly defined victim profile complicated efforts to understand motive further. Some investigators privately concluded the attack likely emerged from overlapping factors impossible to separate cleanly. Severe mental illness may have combined with social isolation, emotional deterioration, internet influence, and access to illegal firearms in ways no single narrative could fully explain. But law enforcement agencies prefer conclusions stronger than complexity. The public prefers certainty even more. As weeks passed, no dramatic breakthrough arrived to simplify the story. No hidden terror network. No manifesto solving the mystery. Instead, investigators assembled a portrait of a deeply troubled man whose internal collapse spilled outward into public violence. Yet even that portrait felt incomplete. There remained gaps impossible to fill because Hussein died at the scene. The central witness to motive no longer existed. Detectives could reconstruct movements, histories, and influences, but they could never fully interrogate the final emotional logic behind the attack itself. That unresolved uncertainty became part of the case's lasting psychological impact. People fear monsters less than they fear incomprehensible human beings. The Danforth shooting resisted clean categorization. It forced uncomfortable acknowledgement that modern violence often emerges from tangled intersections of mental illness, alienation, ideology, loneliness, and societal failure. Investigators kept searching for sharper answers, but the deeper they looked, the more the case resembled a maze without a true center. And somewhere beneath every theory, every debate, every political argument, two people remained dead while an entire city tried desperately to understand how an ordinary summer night became a nightmare no one saw coming. 4 weeks after the Danforth shooting, investigators worked inside a landscape of uncertainty. Every new piece of evidence seemed to point toward a different explanation. Mental illness, extremism, online radicalization, personal collapse, gun trafficking, social isolation. The case refused to settle neatly into any single category, and that ambiguity created enormous pressure on law enforcement agencies, politicians, journalists, and mental health experts alike. Canada wanted answers strong enough to restore a sense of order. Instead, investigators found themselves confronting a more disturbing possibility. There might never be one simple reason why Faisal Hussein walked through Danforth Avenue firing into strangers. Yet despite the confusion, the investigation slowly began revealing patterns hidden beneath the chaos. The breakthrough did not arrive in the form of a dramatic confession or a hidden manifesto discovered inside a locked drawer. It emerged gradually through accumulation. Digital records, psychological history, family testimony, ballistics reports, surveillance footage, medical documents. Tiny fragments assembled piece by piece until investigators could finally begin understanding not just how the attack happened, but the environment of deterioration surrounding the man who carried it out. One of the most significant developments centered on Hussein's mental health history. Behind closed doors, investigators gained access to records and family accounts painting a far more severe picture of psychological decline than the public initially understood. Relatives reportedly described years of escalating psychiatric instability, episodes of psychosis, depression so severe it isolated him from normal life, emotional volatility, long periods where he appeared disconnected from reality itself. Family members had allegedly sought help repeatedly over the years, trying to navigate a mental health system often overwhelmed and fragmented. The details emerging from those investigations revealed a household living under the constant strain of uncertainty and fear long before the shooting occurred. Mental illness inside families rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It accumulates slowly. Missed appointments, mood changes, social withdrawal, disturbing conversations dismissed hopefully as temporary episodes. Loved ones oscillate constantly between fear, denial, guilt, exhaustion, and optimism. Investigators came to understand that Hussein's family had not ignored his struggles. If anything, they appeared trapped inside them. But the system surrounding severe psychiatric illness often operates reactively instead of preventively. Intervention typically becomes strongest only after immediate danger becomes obvious. By then, deterioration may already be advanced. Detectives also reconstructed Hussein's movements and behavior in the months leading up to the attack. Surveillance records and witness accounts suggested increasing isolation. His routines narrowed. Social interactions diminished. There were signs of someone drifting psychologically farther from ordinary life while remaining physically present inside the city around him. Investigators examining his online activity discovered scattered evidence of resentment, disturbing interests, and possible exposure to extremist or misogynistic content, but nothing definitive enough to establish ideological commitment. That became one of the central frustrations of the case. Hussein existed at the intersection of several modern warning signs without fitting entirely inside any one category. He resembled mentally ill perpetrators in some ways, ideologically radicalized attackers in others, and emotionally collapsing isolated individuals in still others. The internet complicated the investigation enormously. Modern radicalization rarely functions through direct recruitment alone anymore. Individuals consume fragmented content from multiple toxic ecosystems simultaneously. Conspiracy theories blend with misogyny. Personal resentment merges with political grievance. Mental instability amplifies online obsession. Investigators discovered indications that Hussein had likely consumed violent or extremist material online, but they could not conclusively prove direct operational influence from any organized ideology. The Islamic State claim remained unsupported. No evidence emerged showing communication with terrorist handlers or participation in organized extremist planning. Yet the attack itself still resembled the kind of random urban violence extremist propaganda often encouraged. The lines between ideological inspiration and psychological breakdown blurred dangerously. Another major breakthrough came through forensic analysis of the firearm. Investigators traced the Smith & Wesson M&P handgun and uncovered evidence suggesting it had been illegally obtained through criminal trafficking channels. This discovery reignited intense national debate surrounding gun smuggling into Canada. While Canadian firearm regulations remained stricter than those in the United States, illegal handguns still moved across borders through organized trafficking networks. The Danforth shooting exposed how vulnerable even relatively strict gun systems remain when illegal firearms circulate underground. Police sources emphasized that Hussein did not legally purchase the weapon himself. That distinction mattered politically because public outrage increasingly focused not only on the shooter but on how someone with a severe psychiatric history accessed a deadly handgun in the first place. Yet even this breakthrough failed to produce emotional closure. Knowing where the weapon came from did not explain why it had been used. The investigation continued, turning inward toward Hussein's psychology. Detectives interviewed people who had interacted with him during different stages of his life. Former classmates, acquaintances, neighbors, medical professionals connected to prior treatment efforts. What emerged was not the portrait of a criminal mastermind or ideological fanatic in the traditional sense. Instead, investigators encountered repeated descriptions of someone increasingly detached from stable reality over many years. One recurring theme surfaced constantly: loneliness. Deep, corrosive loneliness. Modern cities hide loneliness exceptionally well because millions of isolated people move invisibly through crowded streets every day. Hussein lived in one of North America's largest urban centers, surrounded constantly by human activity, yet evidence suggested he remained emotionally disconnected from meaningful social belonging. Experts consulted during the investigation increasingly viewed that isolation as significant. Not because loneliness alone causes violence, but because prolonged alienation can intensify existing psychological instability dramatically. The case began forcing investigators to confront uncomfortable questions extending far beyond one shooter. How many severely struggling individuals exist unnoticed inside major cities? How effectively can societies intervene before deterioration becomes dangerous? At what point does private suffering become public risk? Those questions had no easy answers, but the Danforth shooting made them impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, survivor testimony continued shaping investigators' understanding of the attack itself. Witnesses consistently described Hussein as emotionally detached during the shooting. Calm, mechanical, focused. He did not appear intoxicated by rage or visibly panicked. That behavioral detail became psychologically important. Experts examining the case suggested several possible interpretations. Severe dissociation during psychosis. Emotional numbing associated with suicidal intent. Ideologically influenced dehumanization. Or some combination of all three. Because investigators ultimately believed one fact strongly: Hussein likely expected to die that night. His final confrontation with police and subsequent suicide reinforced the idea that the attack represented not only mass violence but self-destruction. The shooting increasingly appeared less like a coherent political operation and more like the catastrophic collapse of a profoundly disturbed individual carrying violent impulses into public space. Yet that interpretation remained emotionally unsatisfying for many people. Human beings instinctively seek proportional explanations for tragedy. 2 innocent people dead. 13 wounded. A city traumatized. The public wanted a motive large enough to match the scale of suffering. Instead, investigators found fragmentation, psychological instability, emotional deterioration, access to illegal weapons, exposure to toxic online environments. None of it fit together cleanly enough to create comforting clarity. During this stage of the investigation, Toronto itself remained emotionally fragile. Memorials along Danforth Avenue continued growing with flowers, candles, handwritten messages, photographs, and stuffed animals left by grieving strangers. Community vigils drew enormous crowds. Religious leaders, politicians, activists, and survivors spoke publicly about fear, resilience, and healing. Yet beneath the language of unity remained unresolved anxiety. Parents watched children differently in crowded public spaces now. Restaurant patios no longer felt entirely harmless. The city had absorbed another psychological wound only months after the Yonge Street van attack. Confidence in public safety had eroded visibly. For the families of Reese Fallon and Julianne Arcozes, however, the investigation's breakthroughs carried painful emotional complexity. Learning more about Hussein's mental illness did not erase the horror of what he had done. Families grieving violent loss often struggle publicly when discussions shift toward perpetrators' suffering. Compassion for mental illness can feel emotionally incompatible with rage over destroyed lives. Yet the Danforth case forced both realities into the same conversation. Hussein appeared profoundly unwell. He also murdered innocent people. Those truths coexisted whether society felt comfortable with them or not. Investigators eventually reached a broader internal conclusion, though they rarely expressed it in simplistic public terms. The Danforth shooting likely emerged from convergence rather than singular motive. Severe psychiatric illness created vulnerability. Social isolation deepened emotional collapse. Possible exposure to violent ideological content distorted perception further. Access to an illegal firearm transformed dangerous instability into mass casualty violence. Remove any one factor and perhaps the attack never happens. But together they formed a lethal chain difficult to interrupt once fully underway. That realization became the investigation's true breakthrough, not a single dramatic revelation, but the understanding that modern acts of violence increasingly emerge from overlapping systemic failures rather than isolated causes alone. The implications disturbed experts deeply. There was no single policy capable of preventing future attacks completely. Better mental health systems mattered, but they could not eliminate all risk. Stronger gun enforcement mattered, but illegal weapons would still circulate. Monitoring online extremism mattered, but digital radicalization evolved faster than institutions could respond. The Danforth shooting exposed how vulnerable modern societies remain when multiple failures intersect inside one unstable individual. And perhaps most haunting of all was the realization that many warning signs surrounding Hussein only appeared obvious after the massacre. Retrospective analysis creates illusions of predictability. Investigators looking backward could trace deterioration patterns clearly. But in real time, human crises rarely announce themselves with certainty. Families hesitate. Systems become overloaded. Police lack legal authority until direct threats emerge. Society often recognizes danger fully only after violence forces attention. By the time investigators assembled the final portrait of Faisal Hussein, the city had already changed. Danforth Avenue slowly reopened. Restaurants filled again. Summer passed into autumn. But survivors still carried trauma into ordinary life. Families still mourned futures stolen permanently. And investigators, despite months of work, remained haunted by the central truth uncovered through the case. The next public catastrophe might already be developing quietly somewhere inside another isolated mind, hidden beneath the normal surface of city life until the moment violence erupts again. Unlike many true crime cases that end inside crowded courtrooms beneath the glare of cameras and legal argument, the Danforth shooting moved toward a different kind of conclusion. Faisal Hussein died on the night of the attack after exchanging gunfire with Toronto police and ultimately turning the weapon on himself. There would be no murder trial. No dramatic cross-examinations. No jury listening to weeks of testimony before delivering a verdict. For many survivors and grieving families, that absence created a strange emotional vacuum. Courts provide more than punishment. They create narrative structure. A beginning, middle, and end. Evidence is organized publicly. Responsibility is named formally. Society performs accountability through ritual. In the Danforth case, that ritual never arrived. The shooter escaped earthly judgment the moment he pulled the trigger on himself near Bowden Street. But justice systems do not disappear simply because a perpetrator dies. Instead, the legal and emotional aftermath shifted into a different arena. Coroner investigations, police reviews, public policy debates, civil questions, media scrutiny, and political pressure became the mechanisms through which the city attempted to process what happened. The pursuit of justice transformed from punishment into understanding, prevention, and accountability. Yet even those goals proved painfully complicated. In the months following the attack, Toronto police and federal authorities continued releasing investigative findings publicly as they attempted to answer the questions consuming Canada. Officials clarified that despite ISIS claiming responsibility, investigators found no evidence of direct operational ties between Hussein and the terrorist organization. That announcement mattered enormously because it shaped how the nation psychologically categorized the attack. Terrorism carries implications of coordinated ideological warfare. The Danforth shooting increasingly appeared instead as a convergence of severe mental illness, social collapse, possible online influence, and access to illegal firearms. But that explanation did not satisfy everyone. Some critics argued authorities downplayed ideological dimensions too quickly. Others believed mental illness became an overly convenient narrative obscuring broader failures related to extremism and online radicalization. Public debates grew heated because mass violence forces societies into uncomfortable moral territory. People want clear villains, clear systems to blame, clear solutions. The Danforth case resisted simplicity at every stage. The legal focus increasingly turned toward the firearm itself. Investigators confirmed the Smith & Wesson handgun used in the attack had been illegally obtained, intensifying political pressure surrounding gun control and cross-border trafficking. Toronto officials demanded stronger national action against handgun violence, while federal politicians debated reforms aimed at restricting firearm access further. Public hearings and media panels featured police chiefs, criminologists, mental health professionals, and survivors discussing whether the attack could have been prevented. Some argued stricter handgun bans were essential. Others insisted illegal trafficking networks represented the true issue rather than lawful ownership. The conversations reflected a broader North American struggle over how democracies respond to mass shootings without consensus about their causes. Meanwhile, the families of Reese Fallon and Juliana Cozes confronted a reality no policy discussion could repair. Their grief existed separately from political debate. Courtrooms may determine legal responsibility, but they cannot restore stolen futures. Reese's family mourned a young woman whose adulthood had barely begun. Juliana's loved ones faced the unbearable silence left behind by the death of a child. Public statements from the families carried immense emotional weight because they reflected the exhaustion and devastation beneath the headlines. There is a particular kind of pain visible in parents and loved ones forced to speak publicly after violent loss. They search constantly for language capable of expressing something fundamentally beyond language. During memorials and public gatherings, mourners filled Danforth Avenue carrying candles beneath summer skies that now felt permanently altered. Community members embraced strangers while reading the names of victims aloud. Religious leaders spoke about resilience. Politicians promised change. Survivors stood quietly beside memorial walls covered in flowers and handwritten messages. Yet beneath every ceremony lingered the uncomfortable truth that no collective ritual could fully answer the emotional devastation left by random violence. Some survivors later admitted they struggled with anger not only toward Hussein but toward the systems surrounding him. Questions emerged about mental health intervention laws in Ontario. Could authorities have acted earlier if warning signs existed? Did his family receive enough support while trying to manage years of psychiatric instability? Could involuntary treatment mechanisms have prevented further deterioration? These questions generated intense ethical debate because mental health law balances public safety against civil liberties. Democracies hesitate, often appropriately, to grant governments unlimited authority over individuals experiencing psychiatric illness. Yet after mass violence occurs, societies frequently re-evaluate where those boundaries should exist. The Danforth shooting became part of that broader conversation. Mental health experts appearing in public discussions repeatedly warned against simplistic assumptions equating psychiatric illness with violence. The overwhelming majority of mentally ill individuals never harm others. Yet cases like Hussein's complicated public perception because severe psychological deterioration clearly appeared connected to the tragedy somehow. Experts attempted to explain nuance inside emotionally charged environments where nuance often disappears. A person can suffer profoundly from mental illness without becoming violent. A person can also commit violence while mentally ill. Distinguishing between those realities became crucial to preventing stigma while still confronting risk honestly. Survivors of the attack carried their own forms of testimony into the public sphere. Some spoke openly about trauma, recovery, and fear. Others withdrew entirely from media attention, choosing private healing over public visibility. One recurring theme emerged repeatedly from survivor interviews: ordinary life no longer felt entirely safe afterward. Restaurant patios triggered anxiety. Crowded public spaces felt threatening in ways they never had before. Loud popping sounds caused panic responses months later. Trauma does not disappear when news coverage ends. It embeds itself quietly inside nervous systems. For first responders, the aftermath brought another layer of reckoning. Police officers and paramedics involved in the response later acknowledged the psychological toll of the scene. Active shooter incidents involving civilians and children leave lasting emotional scars on emergency personnel. Some responders reportedly sought counseling afterward while others struggled privately. Modern policing increasingly recognizes psychological trauma among first responders, but institutional cultures around emotional vulnerability often remain complicated. Officers are trained to function during chaos, not necessarily to process what they witness afterward. Public officials in Toronto framed the city's response around resilience and unity. Mayor John Tory and other leaders emphasized solidarity during vigils and press conferences. The narrative of communal strength became central to Toronto's recovery efforts because cities traumatized by public violence often fear social fragmentation almost as much as the violence itself. Community events on Danforth Avenue attempted to reclaim the neighborhood symbolically. Festivals resumed. Restaurants reopened fully. Crowds returned gradually. The city wanted to demonstrate that fear would not permanently dominate public life. Yet symbolic recovery differs from emotional recovery. Some survivors never returned comfortably to the neighborhood. Certain restaurants remained psychologically tied to memories of gunfire and bloodshed no matter how normal they appeared afterward. The legal aftermath also extended into broader reviews of emergency response procedures. Authorities examined communication systems, police coordination, medical response timelines, and public alert mechanisms. Mass casualty incidents expose weaknesses in urban emergency infrastructure quickly. Every tragedy becomes both human catastrophe and institutional stress test. Officials studied what worked, what failed, and what required improvement should another attack occur in the future. Quietly beneath all these public processes remained another difficult reality: Faisal Hussein himself would never face questioning. Investigators, psychologists, and grieving families alike were permanently denied direct access to his motivations because he ended his life at the scene. That absence haunted the case continuously. No courtroom testimony would ever clarify his thinking. No interrogation would fully explain why he chose Danforth Avenue, why he targeted strangers, or whether he truly understood his own actions in those final moments. Suicide after mass violence creates a uniquely frustrating form of unfinished justice because accountability becomes psychologically incomplete. The perpetrator disappears while survivors remain trapped inside unanswered questions. For some observers, the lack of trial also prevented deeper public examination of systemic failures. Court proceedings often expose overlooked warning signs, institutional negligence, or missed intervention opportunities through testimony and evidence presentation. In the Danforth case, much of that analysis remained fragmented across investigative reports, media investigations, and policy discussions rather than unfolding through one centralized legal process. As months turned into years, the shooting gradually transitioned from breaking news into historical memory. But historical memory does not mean emotional closure. Anniversaries revived grief publicly each July. Memorials continued honoring Reese Fallon and Juliana Cozes while survivors reflected on lives permanently divided into before and after. Toronto itself carried subtle psychological scars from 2018. The Yonge Street van attack and the Danforth shooting together shattered assumptions many residents once held about urban safety. Public violence no longer felt like something happening only elsewhere. It had happened here. In familiar neighborhoods. On ordinary streets. During ordinary evenings. In the absence of a criminal trial, perhaps the closest thing to judgment emerged through collective memory itself. Faisal Hussein became remembered not as a mysterious anti-hero or ideological martyr, but as the man who brought terror into a crowded Toronto neighborhood and destroyed innocent lives. Reese Fallon became remembered for the future she never reached. Juliana Cozes for the childhood stolen from her. And the city, despite all its debates about guns, mental illness, extremism, and policing, ultimately confronted the same painful truth communities everywhere face after random violence. Justice can punish, investigate, legislate, and memorialize. But it cannot undo 10 minutes of horror on a summer night. Long after the police tape disappeared from Danforth Avenue, long after reporters packed away their cameras and satellite trucks moved on to newer tragedies, the neighborhood continued carrying invisible scars beneath its ordinary routines. On the surface, life returned. Restaurants reopened their patios. Families walked the sidewalks again during warm summer evenings. Music drifted from open doors. Streetcars rattled beneath the Toronto night exactly as they always had. Cities possess an almost brutal instinct for survival. They continue moving because millions of lives depend on movement continuing. But beneath that outward normality, the Danforth shooting remained embedded inside the emotional architecture of the city. Trauma rarely announces itself dramatically after enough time passes. Instead, it lingers quietly inside habits, memories, and instincts. A loud cracking sound causes someone to freeze for half a second too long. A crowded patio suddenly feels exposed. Parents glance more carefully at exits in public places. Survivors avoid certain intersections without consciously explaining why. Fear reshapes behavior gradually until the new version of normal becomes invisible. Toronto changed after 2018, even if many residents struggled to articulate exactly how. The Danforth shooting arrived during a year already heavy with anxiety. The Yonge Street van attack earlier that spring had shattered assumptions about safety in broad daylight. Then came Danforth. 2 acts of public violence only months apart forced the city to confront an uncomfortable truth. Modern urban life carries vulnerabilities no amount of optimism or multicultural pride can fully erase. Toronto still remained safer than many major cities around the world, statistically speaking. But statistics matter very little to human psychology after trauma. Fear is emotional before it is rational. One random shooting inside a beloved neighborhood can alter public consciousness more deeply than years of data ever could. For survivors, healing became deeply personal and uneven. Some eventually returned to Danforth Avenue determined not to surrender cherished places to fear. Others never fully could. Trauma survivors often describe recovery not as overcoming what happened, but learning how to carry it without collapsing beneath its weight. Certain memories remained vivid no matter how much time passed. The sound of gunfire echoing off storefronts. The sight of strangers running in panic. The unbearable confusion of trying to understand whether loved ones were alive or dead. Human memory stores terror differently than ordinary experience. Traumatic moments become fragmented yet hyper-detailed at the same time. Survivors remember tiny sensory details forever while entire stretches of time vanish completely. Some witnesses to the Danforth shooting later admitted they still replayed the event in their minds years afterward, searching unconsciously for alternate outcomes. What if we had chosen another restaurant? What if we left 10 minutes earlier? What if I had reacted faster? Survivors' guilt operates through impossible hypotheticals. The mind creates fictional versions of reality where tragedy becomes preventable because randomness feels emotionally intolerable. Yet randomness was precisely what made the attack so horrifying. There was no meaningful connection between the victims and the man who killed them. Reese Fallon and Juliana Kozes did not know Faisal Hussein. They were simply present during the wrong 10 minutes on a summer night. Their deaths became symbols not because they were famous or politically powerful, but because they represented ordinary innocence interrupted violently. Reese should have begun university. Juliana should have grown older. Those futures vanished not through personal conflict or targeted revenge, but through random public violence impossible for them to anticipate. That randomness unsettled people profoundly because it exposed how fragile ordinary life truly is. In the years following the attack, conversations about mental health intensified across Canada. Hussein's history forced uncomfortable public reflection about psychiatric systems struggling under enormous pressure. Families dealing with severe mental illness often navigate fragmented support structures, inconsistent treatment access, legal limitations, and emotional exhaustion largely invisible to the broader public. Some observers viewed the Danforth shooting primarily through that lens, a catastrophic failure to prevent someone deeply unwell from deteriorating toward violence. Others resisted narratives that seemed to reduce mass murder to illness alone, warning that such explanations risked stigmatizing millions of mentally ill individuals who never harm anyone. Both concerns carried truth. Modern societies continue struggling to discuss mental illness honestly without either demonizing sufferers or ignoring genuine risk factors when severe instability intersects with violence. The case also deepened debate surrounding online radicalization and male alienation. Even though investigators never established definitive ideological motivation, the timing of the attack so soon after the Yonge Street Insel-inspired van attack raised difficult questions about toxic internet subcultures, loneliness, resentment, and emotional collapse among isolated young men. Experts increasingly warned that modern radicalization often grows less through formal organizations and more through fragmented digital ecosystems where grievance, misogyny, conspiracy theories, and violent fantasies reinforce one another gradually.